everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and we're delighted to welcome our panelists, Cindy Cohn, Siobhan Gorman, Robert Knaik, Sherry Ramsey, and our moderator, Jake Braun, to the Council this evening. Just a few quick housekeeping points. We're on the record, we're live streaming tonight, and we welcome social media, but please silence your phones before we begin. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, non-partisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active US engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. The Council organises over 200 events like this every year. And looking ahead, just some highlights. Tomorrow night we'll have a discussion on climate change and global security. That's a conversation between Stephen Cheney of the American Security Project and Karen Weigert of the Chicago Council. On February 15th, we'll have a debate on the question of, is human rights dead? That's between Eric Posner of the University of Chicago and Ian Hurd of Northwestern University. And on February 23rd, we'll have a panel discussion on the future of work. That's with Simon Pemberton of Walgreens Boots Alliance, Rick Wartzman of the Drucker Institute, and Amy Webb of the Future Trends Institute. Turning back to this evening's program, I look forward to a discussion on cybersecurity and more broadly, the larger and continually evolving relationship between technology and democracy. As we saw in the early days of the Arab Spring and elsewhere, technology can strengthen movements for democracy. But we've also learned recently that technology can be used to spread liberal ideas and to interfere in the democratic process. So how can open network societies balance transparency and security in the digital age? We have an expert panel to explore this question this evening. And they look forward to taking your questions later on. When we get to the audience Q&A, you can raise your hands, but this being a cyber-related panel, we also encourage online questions. There should be a link on the screen to my right, which has the direction is chi.cnf.io is the link. If you put that straight into your browser, you can ask a question, you can vote on other people's questions too. So this evening's panel, I'll introduce them very quickly. From left to right, I guess my left. Your right to left. Next to, the far side, we have Sherry Ramsey at the far end. Thank you. She is a senior advisor at Cyberpoint International. She was previously director of the NSA CSS Threat Operations Center. Next to Sherry is Robert Knaik. He is the Whitney Shepherdson Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was responsible for the development of presidential policy on cybersecurity while serving as Director of Cybersecurity at the National Security Council. Closer is Siobhan Gorman. She's a director at the advisory firm, the Brunswick Group, where she works on cybersecurity issues. And she also reported for many years on cybersecurity, data, privacy issues, terrorism, and intelligence for the Wall Street Journal. Next closest is Cindy Cohn. She is the Executive Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which focuses on issues surrounding user privacy, internet freedom, and technology development. Previously, Cindy was a civil rights litigator in a private practice handling technology-related cases. She also previously worked for the United Nations. And then our moderator this evening is Jake Braun. He is the CEO of Cambridge Global Advisors. He's worked extensively on technology, national security, and economic issues. He also teaches a course on cybersecurity policy at the University of Chicago's Harris School. Please join me in welcoming our panel this evening.
First of all, thanks, Ian, and thanks to the Council for putting on this event, and to the panelists for coming out here. Many of you, I know, had to travel a pretty long distance for this. And I do, as a native Chicagoan, want to applaud the Council for trying to make Chicago a center of gravity in cybersecurity. The city's needed this for a long time. And I also applaud them for the fact that I think this is, it's a great new time in cybersecurity when 3 of our panelists are women. That didn't used to be the case years ago, and I applaud the Council for getting that done. I happen to be kind of in the middle of this last August, September, October. I was on the National Finance Committee for Hillary Clinton, and because of my background, had been talking to the campaign extensively about this. At the same time, I work on cybersecurity at Homeland Security and at the Pentagon, had, because of my work here, I've been doing stuff with state and local governments. And one of the things that was shocking to me as I talked to folks from every single side of this equation was that everybody I spoke to said, no, this is a complete disaster. I can't believe what's going on, well, I don't know if it's the Russians or whoever, but yes, thank goodness whoever's in charge. And whoever was always a different person depending on who I spoke to. And really, what became very clear to me sometime in mid-October was that everybody thought somebody else was in charge. And the people who were administering the elections at the very local level didn't have the resources or capabilities they needed to deal with the threat. And everybody from the private sector to the intel community to the federal civilian law enforcement folks, all thought somebody else had the ball. And that was very disconcerting at the very least, which I think was one of the reasons that we decided to set up this panel. So in keeping with that, one of the things that I thought we would try and focus on tonight is kind of who's in charge. And I think there's three pieces to that. One is vis-a-vis the Russians and what other democracies they're going to attack, and if they're going to do anything else to our democracy, and how we should be thinking about that, and what the U.S. role is in that, if anything at all. Two is, in terms of different authorities and so on, from state and local governments to the federal government, to the private sector, who's in charge and at what level are they in charge? And then finally, where do we go from here? I think we were having a conversation previous to this, and I think there's some very interesting perspectives from the intel community, from the governance perspective, from the private sector, and from the academic and legal community on where we should go from here. And I'm excited to hear from the panel on all those topics, and then we'll turn it over to you all, because I think we'd be most interested in hearing from all of you. So with that, why don't I ask you, Sherry, you, I guess, can't confirm or deny whether you've been following the Russians around our networks for the last couple decades. But what do you think the Russians are up to, first of all? And second of all, what do you think the new administration can or should do, if anything, to protect our democracy or other democracies around the world?
So I think we've all read some of the things that Mr. Putin has stated. And I think at this point, his goal, his short-term goal is basically to restore Russia to its proper place in the world. And, that is, he is looking back to during the Cold War, when there was basically the Soviet Union and the US. And, they were the leader of part of the world, and we were the leader of the other part of the world. So if you think about that, back then, of course, we didn't have the internet back then like we do today. But back then, they did everything possible to undermine faith and democracy in all of our countries. They considered us the enemy. They, wanted to basically win the hearts and souls and minds of the people in the democratic countries over to their way of life. And I think basically he is really trying to restore that. I don't know that this is, something new, and then he's trying to attack us. I basically think he's doing exactly what they've been doing before, only this time it's a little bit more deadly because they have this thing called the internet that allows them to do that. So I think it's not necessarily a directed attack on the U.S. I think we've seen France, Germany, the Netherlands all are democratic democracies who have elections coming up. I think they're all worried, as they should be. I believe potentially the same thing, there will happen that happened here. And in terms of what happened, I'm not so sure necessarily. My own personal opinion is that the Russians were trying to tilt the election one way or the other. I think they were simply trying to have us lose faith in the system and wonder, and they didn't have to tilt the election, because the second they had us all wondering if they tilted the election, then they were successful. So that's kind of my take on what happened. In terms of what should we do, I think at this point, quite frankly, I don't know that we're in a good place to protect our own selves as well as anyone else. Although I would like to think that we will take steps under this administration to try to rectify that problem. And I do think we also obviously want to be viewed as the leader of the world of democracies. And so, yes, I think as we take steps to try to protect our own networks. I'd like to think we would share those plans, those steps that we've taken with our friends and allies so that they can help protect their own.
So, Rob, I think you were in the previous administration during many of them I think are now public attacks that the Russians did on our government. How are you guys thinking about what the Russians were up to and also what our response should be and what the next administration's response should be?
Thanks, Jake. So the challenge with Russia is that for most of the Obama administration, they really were playing by what some people called a new set of Moscow rules, right? Moscow rules were the idea about how the Russians, how the KGB and the CIA spied during the Cold War, right? And there were rules about what you would target, what would you do if you caught a spy. It was all kind of part of a great game where the goal was to gain intelligence value over your adversary, and it was understood that spying was a natural part of the relationship. And so for about the last 10 years, the view of Russia really was that in cyberspace, we transported those rules over. And they understood, unlike the Chinese, what were the natural limits on espionage, that they needed to be targeted, that they needed to be focused, that they needed to be stealthy, that they could go after things like the White House and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the State Department. These are traditional targets for espionage. And what could they do with that information? Well, they could take information and then use it to their decision advantage. That's the traditional purpose of espionage. So I think for a lot of the Obama administration, the view really was that Russia was acting within the norms about what you could do in cyberspace as a nation state. And I even think that there was almost a grudging respect for Russian tradecraft in this space, that these guys were really good and they were really hard to find. And this contrasted with the Chinese, who were loud, who were sloppy, who were everywhere, who were always getting caught, and when they got caught, it affected the bilateral relationship between China and the United States, right? And it also really caused concern and was the predominant focus of US cyber policy because they weren't just spying on DoD and the White House. They were spying on Google and they were spying on IBM and they were stealing secrets from these companies and giving them to their national champions. So by contrast, it was like, yeah, the Russians are playing by our rules. They're okay, right? What do we need to do to counter Russia? We need to improve our own defenses, right? Not shame on them, shame on us. So that, I think, was how Russia was treated for most of the Obama administration. And then suddenly, they began to do in the United States what they had done in their near abroad. And I don't think anybody was watching that closely enough or was planning for how to counter it. So to finish up here, I think the real challenge for the Trump administration is A, to get on board with the idea that they need to counter Russia in this space, that they need to do it so the rest of the world doesn't decide to involve themselves in the election in 2020 using the same kind of tactics and techniques. And then the really hard part, they've got to come up with a plan for how they counter Russia. Russia is a very different problem than China. We had all these levers with the Chinese economy and with their desire to rise to greatness that we don't have with Russia, which is a shrinking population, a shrinking economy, and a power in decline. And so what do you do to counter Russia? I don't know, but that is the challenge that the Trump administration's got to solve.
Great. Siobhan, I know you've been reporting on many of these things over the years. What is your thoughts on both the Russians, what they're up to, and what the Trump administration should do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, Rob makes a good point about sort of the trajectory of the Russians. And I think that there was a point at which it seemed like the Russians were operating pretty differently in cyberspace. And at least for me, having kind of covered it over the years, that was the point at which, it became pretty apparent that the U.S. government couldn't get them out of the State Department. They kind of kept coming back. They were in the White House. They were, and they were being discovered, and yet you couldn't get them out. And so I think that suggested sort of a certain amount of persistence and staying power and a lack of stealthiness, really, that suggested that maybe their motivations were shifting a little bit. And so I do think that, as you see with a lot of emerging threats, and this is kind of agnostic of a particular administration, it takes a while to understand when somebody's either intentions or tactics are really shifting, because your assumption is always it's going to be basically what it was before. But the Russians have been pretty active, and even in uncomfortable places. The intelligence agencies found evidence of Russian and Chinese, operators in the electric grid dating back at least to 2009 and probably 2008. So, that's not really surveillance, not when you're doing little leave-behind bomb type things. And so that alarmed people. But, it's kind of hard to know what that really meant. So, you kind of move forward through the years, and the people who were charged with figuring this out, it's a genuinely hard problem to sort out. But one would have hoped that by the time it became pretty clear to the U.S. government, certainly the FBI and everybody, all the government agencies it was working with, that the Russians had hacked the DNC, that should have raised more alarm bells, I think, than it did. And I think that, because it was in the middle of an election that was obviously very politically charged, as many elections are, but this one was uniquely so, I think that left the government a little bit paralyzed and not wanting to appear to be intervening in any particular way, and that gave a lot of license to the Russians to kind of do what they were going to do, and it left the administration, you can debate whether it was right or wrong, but certainly left them kind of paralyzed. In terms of going forward, I think that the Trump administration needs to make clear what its policy is and make clear how it's going to pursue it. We've gotten a lot of mixed messages in terms of Russia. Tillerson says no, they are an adversary, and yet, we get lots of other statements saying, that it's not very clear. And I think that it was hard enough for an administration to counter a Russian cyber threat when at least the orientation was clear. You could argue whether it was exactly the right orientation, but it was at least clear that the very first step is just going to be coming up with a coherent viewpoint and strategy, and actually building something from there, because otherwise they're just going to run rampant over our systems and many other governments, because a lot of foreign governments rely on our intelligence to figure out what's going on. And if we can't sort of design a policy and a game plan to try to figure that out, then I think that there are many countries that are going to be in a real state of pain on this.
So picking up on your point about having a real consistent game plan, Cindy, I'd like to shift gears a little bit, and what was clear during the election is that as a government, and really including the private sector, authorities are a mess. It's, again, totally unclear who's in charge. I know you've actually been bringing cases in this space and do have a deep understanding of where some authorities lie, but what do you think we need to do to clean up our own house from a federal government or just U.S. perspective in terms of having a coherent strategy on who's in charge of what, and what challenges do you see arising out of that?
Yeah, I really think we need to bring the security into the cybersecurity debate, because part of what we struggle with a lot is we've built a very insecure digital world, and we have pretty consistently as a society not put in places strong incentives for the companies that are building our infrastructure and the government that's trying to deal with security threats to actually build a more secure internet. And in fact, there's many parts of the government that are actively working against this. I've spent a long time trying to make sure that people have access to strong encryption, which is one of the single best ways you can protect people and networks and systems from hackers, from external security threats. And instead of being a strong proponent of getting encryption into every little bit of our networks, including our election systems, we face an FBI that says their number one priority is making sure you don't have strong encryption. So, the first thing I'd like the government to do is just get the hell out of the way and let us build strong technologies that will protect our systems. That's easy, low-hanging fruit, right? That we should do that as a society, and instead of calling, companies that try to deploy strong security as if they are, criminals, they should be supporting that and building incentives into our structure to pull along the companies that may not be interested in building stronger security, because it can cost a little more. So I think that would be one thing. The second thing that we're doing, as you alluded, is we've brought litigation to try to make sure that people who are the victims of cybersecurity attacks can do one of the kind of core ways that we create incentives for companies and peoples and governments to act correctly, which is bring a lawsuit. We represent a guy in Maryland who had his computer attacked and taken over by the government of Ethiopia, and everything he and his family did on their family computer shipped back to an IP address that's controlled by the government of Ethiopia. We were bringing a civil lawsuit. It's a tort. It's a wiretap violation. It's a serious felony in this country to tap into somebody's Skype calls. And we're not getting any support from the US government. We're not getting any support from any government. And the government of Ethiopia says, well, it's okay because we did it by remote control from Ethiopia. We didn't have actual spies on the ground in the United States. So we're Ali Oxen free. We're all free under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. And that's pretty frustrating, right? This is an old-fashioned tool we have in the United States. It creates a measure of accountability. It needs to be buttressed by government action as well. But to be like a tiny little nonprofit in San Francisco trying to create a channel for people who are attacked by foreign governments to be able to get some measure of justice and get no help at all from the government, it's pretty frustrating and I think a little sad. So, there's this cybersecurity conversation going on up here, but those of us who are the victims of these kinds of attacks, we're not getting the help that we need to protect ourselves and to build strong networks. So those are a couple of ideas that I have.
So just to dig into this litigation side quickly. So a guy that I know really well, he's the founder of the largest hacker conference in the world. His name's Jeff Moss. He came to DC a few years ago in hopes of really educating policymakers on how to write good legislation in cybersecurity and everything else, and has now decided that he doesn't trust the federal government or any other government to do anything in cybersecurity. And his answer is, he says, just sue everybody. We should just sue everybody and let the courts figure this out, because he has no faith in Congress or anybody else. So as an attorney and part of an organization that does do some of this, what do you think of that strategy?
Well, I think we need a little better laws. I love hackers. I've represented them for 26 years. Sometimes their understanding about how you sue somebody and what that means we're working on it every day. But sure, I would love for there to be better ways for companies to be held accountable when they build lousy security, and people to be able to get justice when that lack of security hurts them. I'm a litigator. I like courts, but I think that we don't have that infrastructure in place yet, and that may mean Congress has to step in and create those kinds of things. That alone won't do it. I'm not saying there's no role for statecraft here. I'm just saying that, as I look at the cybersecurity things, there are easier things that we can do than that we ought to do to try to make us more secure. And they're especially important in things like our elections, which aren't run by the State Department or the Department of Defense. They're run by your county election officials. And so taking some of this security idea and making it go down rather than keep on pushing it up, I think can be very helpful in the particular thing that we're talking about here tonight, which is how do we safeguard our elections?
Yeah, and so Rob, I know this was a main conversation at the NSC for a long time, is who's in charge of what. And obviously, legislation wasn't going to happen, or at least, there was some, but I don't know if it got you guys what you wanted. So how do we attack this problem, and who does the attacking of the problem, and which part of it?
So I can give you some insight into how the Obama administration thought about this problem and how they built it up. Obviously, I have no idea what the Trump administration is likely to do. I can talk a little bit about what they've said so far and what the signs may point to. I'll try and do some tea leaf reading. So if you look at the problem of cybersecurity, it doesn't naturally fit into a single agency, right? It's one of those problems that the phrase we always use to describe it, it requires all instruments of national power. It requires diplomacy, it requires intelligence, it requires military action sometimes, it requires economic sanctions sometimes, and it requires working with the private sector above all else. So it's a very different problem than other traditional national security problems, where you can essentially say, we've got a hammer, looks like a nail, we'll go solve it, right? And so that was the approach that we took in the Obama administration. That's really, really hard to do, right? You're trying to coordinate very, very large agencies which actually have their own interests and their own desires and their leadership that wants to take things in the direction that they want to go in, that may not be in the national interest of the United States. So that was the challenge that we faced. And in order to manage all that, we had a small office at the White House headed by a coordinator that was trying to manage all the various issues on this piece. And what we realized was that we didn't have agreement on who had what roles, that was not in fact clear to the agencies, and it certainly wasn't clear to our partners in the private sector. So we ended up coming up with something that was called the bubble chart, which tried to put the three main players in cybersecurity in a bubble without any overlap, right? And to say, okay, we're gonna have the Defense Department. Defense Department is responsible for protecting .mil. Defense Department is responsible for carrying out offensive cyber operations. And Defense Department is responsible for the NSA for intelligence collection. Then we had our DOJ law enforcement FBI bucket, right? FBI is responsible for investigating cyber crimes and is responsible for coordinating that with other law enforcement agencies. And then DOJ is responsible for prosecuting. And then we had Homeland Security, where the mission was always a little bit opaque. It had the responsibility for coordinating federal civilian agency cyber defense, and it had the responsibility for supporting the private sector to protect itself, but did not actually have the authority or the capability to go out and provide protection. So that's what the setup looked like. The big addition to this is, in the Obama administration, was a decision to say that what we were missing with those three bubbles was a fourth bubble, that what we did not have was what we had in the counterterrorism world. Counterterrorism, there's something called the NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, which was created after 9/11. If you remember that whole, failed to connect the dots after 9/11. Well, after a lot of cyber incidents, we failed to connect the dots beforehand. And so needing an organization that did two things, that would bring together intelligence, analyze it, push it out to network defenders, push it out to investigators. So we stood that up in 2015. It's a work in progress. The other thing that organization is supposed to do is support the development of plans that will address threats like, how do you counter Russia? How do you counter Iran? How do you continue to counter China? So that's a work in progress. Now, as far as what the Trump administration is going to do, the early signs, in my view, were not good. There was very much okay, we're going to have the military solve this problem. Right after the election, the only thing that the president-elect said about cybersecurity was, I'm going to ask the Department of Defense to come up with a plan to protect critical infrastructure from cyber and other attacks. And everybody in my world went, oh God. Right? That kind of violates 3 or 4 statutes, maybe the Constitution and longstanding traditions of the separation of civilian and military life. So that was a bad sign. What we've seen since then is a little more encouraging. There was a draft executive order that got leaked out. It was not very good. If one of my students had written it, I would have given it a B, sent it back for revision. That's actually what Trump did. He pulled it and said, we're not releasing it. We may see a new one tomorrow. But what it did show was continuing to understand that DOD has a mission, DHS has a mission, those missions are different. They forgot about the Department of Justice. I think they're going to add that back in the next version. But it was all in all a pretty good sign that they're heading in the direction of saying, we understand what the roles are and we know what we need to do is build on this and not start anew. So I think that's a fairly good sign.
Yeah, what's interesting is, as the Obama administration was thinking through all this, at no point did anybody say, I mean, maybe they did, but from what you're saying, it sounds like no. Oh, and by the way, we have this really important thing that's going on, which is administering elections and so on, and gee, where does that fall? And, obviously, but I mean, why would anybody have even thought of it back in 2015, I mean, it wouldn't have even occurred to anyone. And so I think while...
Well, it occurred to us. I mean, honestly, I've been working with the Verified Voting Organization since the creation of the electronic voting machine stuff that came out of the Help America Vote Act, which came out of the hanging Chad stuff we all remember, right? And, the worries about these systems being insecure and the increasing push, some of it led by the Department of Defense because they wanted military overseas to be able to vote, to put voting on the internet is something that we've spent a lot of time working on. So, I mean, I'm glad they've come to it now, but it's not like nobody thought of it. It was that nobody was listening to the people who understand how how the electronic technologies were working and were raising their hands and jumping up and down as much as we can and saying, God, don't connect these things to the internet, don't put them in digital, there's a real vulnerability here.
But at the same time, I mean, what we saw happen in this election wasn't actually hacking of the election process. What we saw was actually something that was frankly a little bit more sophisticated because it undermines the whole infrastructure, right? Yes. I mean, if you can get into a campaign and just put out, you control the information flow instead of, the people who actually live in that country. That's a totally different thing. And so I think it's extraordinarily important to make sure that the election systems are protected from hacking, but I'm actually a lot more worried about having the process hacked, which was kind of what happened here. And it happened so gradually that people didn't fully appreciate it. And I don't think that, the whole kind of fake news discussion didn't even really emerge till afterward, because I think that a lot of it happened in such a subtle way that it was really hard to know, was this having an influence? And it was really easy to discount in a, what was already sort of a very, politically charged election, to know that this little piece of it was actually going to have an impact. It's not knowable, but now we see that there are so many small things, that we're influencing it, that we don't know what to make of it anymore. And I think that that's actually what ends up undermining the process. And so, I hope, I haven't seen a lot of indication of it, but I do hope that the Trump administration, realizing that they're going to be facing an election in 2020, understands that they need to do something to restore faith in that whole process, because the idea that people can just kind of come in and, just do teeny tiny changes to the type of information that's going out, or in some cases very large, but questionably meaningful changes, that's going to affect them too. That affects all of us.
Well, and so we were talking about private sector earlier, and I think, the government's been doing all this, planning as who's in charge and so on, but, obviously .mil and .gov are this big, and .com is this entire building, right? So in your conversations with folks in the private sector, how are they thinking about this stuff, and what are they doing to address the new attacks that are going to be coming at them, in the coming years?
Well, I think that, it's a statement of the obvious to say that there's just a wide range across different sectors and different companies. Some are incredibly sophisticated about it. You see that particularly in the financial sector, but even there are lots of challenges that they face. We talk with folks in the financial sector who are really, really worried about a destructive attack that undermines faith in financial markets, right? You see the same kind of thing in, the energy sector or the transportation sector. The notion of destructive attacks, things that can take down computers and take down systems and paralyze them for some extended period of time, I think that those are things that those industries haven't really grappled with how they're going to deal with it. I mean, they've created their ISACs or whatever they're called these days, ISAOs, these information sharing organizations, and that's helpful, but that doesn't necessarily tell them what to do. It just tells them what has happened in some cases for those who are willing to share. And, they'll do simulations, which will help kind of identify gaps. But, it's not, I haven't seen a lot of evidence of at least sort of the major sectors ignoring the problem, so to speak. But I do think that there is some sense, especially among, some of the larger participants, that, ultimately the government's going to play a big role. And even though they don't necessarily want a lot of regulation and things like that, they assume that when there is a huge problem, the government's going to kind of come riding to the rescue. And I'm not speaking for every company out there, but there are many that do feel that way. And I, from having covered this for a lot of years and talked to a lot of people in government, I don't think that many people in government, and I would guess even fewer in this administration, think that they're going to come riding to the rescue if a major company has an issue. But there hasn't been a really clear message sent to the private sector either, because throughout the Obama administration, you had what seemed to be, I don't know if it was a policy, but sort of a regular set of decisions not to intervene, not to identify foreign actors. And one thing that we saw sort of, I think the Sony case might have been the first time, at least that I recall, naming names. That was a huge deal. And the president came out and talked about it. And that was really interesting. But to some companies, it sort of sent a signal, one, that they probably should be speaking about their incident, not the president. But two, that the government was getting a little bit more comfortable with getting involved, but it's not clear what that involvement's really going to be. And I don't know many companies that really want NSA to come in and be their help desk. At the same time, I'm not sure that they really know what the alternative is if, Iran is breaking into their system, if Russia is breaking into their system. So there's a lot of lack of clarity in terms of, who's ultimately in charge or who's really in a position to fix it or do something about it or make meaningful changes that will prevent this.
Well, okay,
what's
I was just going to ask
interesting
you.
too, and I lived through quite a bit of this, was that many companies out there, and I agree, they want the government like this at arm's length until they need the government. And then it's like, well, what could the government do? And right now, I would say there's no supporting policy framework or even a legal framework that actually would provide the scenario in which the government could actually come in and do something.
They do it on like a one-off basis.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure
what
that would be.
Yeah.
The other thing, the interesting thing, and we mentioned, particularly in the private sector, and we worry about in the critical infrastructure and water and electricity and so forth, actually having somebody come in and destroy something. But kind of what's happening now, and I think it's more insidious almost than what we've talked about, is they're actually stealing our intellectual property. And I, as a great American, I think, say that the one thing this country has above many, many others, and that is we are smart. That's what we can do. We have our intellectual property. A lot of the manufacturing, all that's moved offshore, but the ideas, everything comes from here. And so the research that we are able to fund and do, I think, puts us above almost any other, probably I'd say any other country. And so what they're doing is they're not coming in to destroy anything. They're coming in very secretively, and they're stealing our intellectual property. They're taking that from companies. And I'll give you an example that I probably couldn't have talked about a couple of years ago, but now it's actually been in the news. The Department of Defense has been building something called the Joint Strike Fighter for years, 15, maybe 20 years now, long time. And you can only imagine how many different companies, how much money has been spent on the Joint Strike Fighter. And now all of a sudden we have another country who has fielded an aircraft that looks remarkably like the Joint Strike Fighter. And by the way, they fielded it before we did. So, if you think about just that one example, and that's a military example, but, I wonder how many years and dollars and research that saved them. And not only that, but now, they actually, since they know how the system works, they can build countermeasures to that. And in fact, they can sell that technology to people that we don't want to have that technology. So that is very, very scary. But that's a military application. The same thing is happening, for example, in the pharmaceutical world and in other, countries either supported by government in some way, they're coming in and they're actually, in an insidious way, stealing our intellectual property, and that's allowing them to get an economic advantage over us. And I think today, if we really talk about national security, the economy is one of the big parts of that. You know, we used to only talk about military, but now we really need to talk about the economy and the global economy. And so I think that is what's scary to me. And I'm not sure what the government can do, you know, even if asked what the government could do to that. And it's just, it's interesting how, you know, that this is, I think we haven't even realized this is happening. And I think one day we're going to wake up and say, oh my God, and I'm not sure what we're going to do at that point.
Well, so
But I
to
do
that
think,
end,
sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so to that end, just to let her ever finish this. So I know one of the things that you're doing since you've left NSA is, so Sherry did defense at NSA as well, is companies have brought you in to do cyber assessments for them and help them figure out how to clean up their own house. So what can these private sector companies do to actually protect themselves? Or what do you see them doing that they actually can afford to do and so on when they've got maybe a nation state or somebody after them?
So I will say today, we actually make it very easy for them. They're not even having to use their super class A tools if they got them. We don't know whether, we assume they have them. We don't know whether they have because we don't require them to use them because, you know, I don't know how often you think about these networks and you go in and, you know, the default password from the company is the password still being used even though the equipment's been there for 3 or 4, 10 years. Or the passwords are password, you know, and they're not in the most secure configuration. So I think, you know, one of the things that we always talk about is you have to make your networks defensible. And the way that you can do that is you set them up in the most secure configurations. And first of all, you have to know exactly what you have on your network. You know, believe it or not, a lot of people, when you ask them, do you have an inventory of all the devices on your network? And they'll say yes. And then when you come in and do a network assessment, it turns out, no, they don't even know what's connected to their network. The same with software. So I think there are becoming, what is very important is for all these companies to do a network assessment. And there's something that's been put together kind of as a grassroots effort. It was actually started by NSA, but it really has sort of taken a life of its own, quite frankly, globally. And this is something called the 20 Controls. I don't know if you've heard of that. They're supported by the Center for Internet Security. And if you read them, you'll say, oh, well, this is so easy. This isn't rocket science. And you know what? We have to start somewhere. And it starts out, the first control is know all the hardware that's on your network. The second one is know all the software that's on your network. And then as you go further down, is every piece of hardware configured in the most secure configuration possible? Is every piece of software? So I think, you know, what we have to do is raise the bar, and we can do that and make it much harder for them simply by doing these network assessments. And I think, you know, there actually are beginning now to be tools out there. There's a couple that I'm familiar with. One is called NIMS, which was developed by Lawrence Livermore. And, you know, have someone, if you don't know how to do it, I think at a relatively inexpensive cost, you can actually have someone come in and do an assessment of your network. And this isn't a one-time thing, obviously. It has to, you know, be going on and on and on. But I think there are a number of things that we can do, like I said, to make it way harder to raise the bar and make it harder for the bad guys to get in. I think at the end of the day, it's probably going to end up being, we raise the bar, they're going to have to raise their game. We raise the bar, they're going to have to raise their game. But I think it's important that we make it as hard as we can and as expensive as we can for them to actually break into the networks. And at some point, you know, you're going to start seeing lesser adversaries kind of fall off. They're going to say, we can't keep track of that. And, you know, kind of another philosophy, and I'll just kind of throw it out here, is probably a determined nation state, like the larger ones that we've been talking about here, will probably almost always find a way to get in. But there are other things that we can do, like, you know, kind of hunting or looking inside of your networks. A little bit more sophisticated. But I think there's so many things that we can do that we don't have to do that yet to make it more difficult. And so I think kind of my philosophy would be make your networks defensible, and then you've got to defend them. Today, the philosophy of a lot of people is, you know, we have system administrators, but, you know, they give out passwords and usernames and stuff like that. No, that our mindset has to change. We have to be defending our network 24/7. If somebody's gonna hack into your network, when do you think they're gonna do it? Maybe on the weekend when no one's there? Nobody's looking, right? So we really it's something called continuous monitoring. You really have to monitor your network. And so all of these things are really, they would raise the bar tremendously. They're not that difficult or that expensive to do.
Okay, sorry.
No, I just want to say I agree very much with the last point. I think there's an annual report that Verizon does every year, and that it's something like 80% of the vulnerabilities they find are just their patches have been available sometimes for years. I mean, sometimes the cybersecurity conversation is this weird thing where we're talking about nation states and defending against the Russians, but when you actually get down to it, like there's a whole lot of stuff that's not, on the TV show The Americans that is really going to be really helpful for the vast majority of people. And one of the ways we talk about security sometimes is that you want to make your adversary have to you don't want to let them drift net fish through your stuff. You want to make them use a line and a pole, right? You want to increase the effort that it takes to try to get in, and you're gonna make it harder, and you're gonna make them have to spend more energy on it, and it's gonna be a way to protect you. I did want to say about intellectual property. I certainly think that protecting our intellectual property is really important. It makes me nervous, and I know you're not with the NSA anymore, but when I hear the NSA start to talk about getting its mission bigger, and now they're worried about all, something beyond kind of terrorism and state to state and catching spies and things like that, because every government agency has its issues, but we're certainly living in a time where the NSA's view of its own authority and its ability to spy on people in the United States and around the world is something I'm not comfortable with, and that they've scaled back again. So having their mission creep over to protecting everybody's intellectual property is something I think we need to really think hard about in a nation if we want to give the government that kind of give the people with who the ability to kind of go after those kinds of crimes, as opposed to the ones where we've given them pretty strong powers when it comes to trying to protect us against people who want to blow us up. I'm not sure we want those same powers deployed against people who are engaged in what are more commonplace crimes.
So now we've talked about arcane legal jargon, some highly technical things, and insider government authorities. So with that, I thought maybe we'd turn it over to folks in the crowd and maybe let some of our experts here answer some questions.
Well, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We have some microphones in the audience. You can also ask questions online. We've already got a few of those. Anyone in the audience want to start off? Or there with the kind of third row back. Thanks, Kellen.
Hi, good evening. Is this working?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, very interesting panel so far. My name is Patrick Maldry. I am from Estonia. We actually have figured out internet voting, by the way, using cryptography pretty well.
No.
Really?
I'll send the hackers over tomorrow. They've already been some there.
We've had our share, don't worry. So I am I'm a former soldier, diplomat, political analyst, and now technical cybersecurity practitioner. I've been analyzing the Russian cyber threat for quite some time, from the days of Clifford Stoll in '88 to what's going on in this recent election. I think it's pretty clear that we haven't used our intelligence community capabilities, because if we'd done a red team analysis from a cyber point of view on our society as a whole and on our political system as a whole, we would have realized that elections are an extremely vulnerable point in a democracy that a red team, in this case a particular nation state, can easily exploit to cause chaos and to cause frustration. But I think an even more concerning development is countries that are beginning to develop capabilities to attack critical infrastructure. So the FSB in particular has said publicly that they're devoting roughly $250 million in the next few years to developing capabilities to attack critical financial infrastructure, to attack military command and control systems, and to attack electric grids, right? And that capability has been around for quite some time. You can argue that the intent hasn't been there yet, but we've seen from my view of the world that Russia has continued to become more aggressive and more ambitious in its use of cyber capabilities, and I've argued publicly for cyber deterrence and a policy of cyber deterrence in this case. I think the Obama administration has taken the first steps in the use of all of the national power in terms of indictments, in terms of diplomatic power, and sanctions so far, but what else can we do to deter attacks on our critical infrastructure, both here and in Europe? Thank you.
From the Russians specifically, or anybody?
Let's take one at a time.
Okay. Who wants to go?
Sure. So, I mean, you're raising one of the scariest points, right? If what we missed was what Russia was doing to other people's elections before they did it to our election, we should be very scared about our electric grid. In 2015, and then a year later, Russian hackers took down the power grid in 2 different parts of Ukraine, maybe only for a few hours each time, but they did it through cyber means. It's confirmed. There's a very long and excellent report by the SANS Institute that will walk you through how they did it and how the Ukrainian utilities responded. And the scariest conclusion from that report is that Ukraine was able to send people out in pickup trucks to all the distribution centers and return to manual control of the grid. And that's probably something that is no longer possible in the United States. So we can all hope that the current honeymoon between Trump and Putin will last. But if you know about honeymoons with Russia, they don't tend to last, right?
And hope is really not a good strategy.
Hope is not a good strategy in cyber, right? So we saw...
Ever. It's never a good strategy.
It may be our only one. But we saw this with, right, when Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul, and then 8 years later, none other than Hillary Clinton was at the start of the Obama administration working on a strategic reset with Russia, where she handed Russia her Russian counterpart a big red reset button and said, we're going to have a different relationship with you before we pivot to Asia. That didn't work out so well, and here we are 8 years later. So we can pretty well assume that the Trump administration and Putin will find conflict. And at that point, I would be very, very surprised if we don't see the lights go out somewhere in America. So, agree with you, that's the biggest problem. What can you do to deter that? Well, what can you do to deter Russia? That's the big question. I don't know if any of the things that the Obama administration was able to do to change Chinese behavior really apply to Russia. So,
Well, and I think
sure
that,
they changed the behavior either.
no. And I think that
China? Oh, absolutely. We can get into that later, but this isn't about China.
I think that the Trump administration is going to have to figure out what it wants to do before it can deter anything. I think that having a more reactive posture like what we've seen so far is scary because you don't know what the limits are. And if they can't at least internally decide what the limits are, you could see yourself going down a line of just sort of this escalation kind of behavior that, people say that, the deterrence didn't work in the Obama administration maybe because it wasn't taking strong enough measures, and having sort of tracked that over time, I know how much time it took to just get to where they were, because it can be very hard to get agreement across really large groups of people. But what you don't want to do is go so far in the other direction where you have like 3 people making the decisions all the time, and then you're just the pendulum swings so far that all of a sudden you're sort of creating all these retaliatory measures in cyberspace, and all of a sudden everybody's electric grid's going out. And I think that we really need to make sure that as the Trump administration studies critical infrastructure and threats there and things like that, they really are thinking about sort of what that looks like if they do find themselves countering specific threats, and how they can do it in a controlled way so that you don't have things going off in a direction that we've been really trying to avoid. I mean, part of the reason why I think, and this was true in the Bush administration too, that you've seen administrations be so careful in cyberspace is because there's a huge fear of unintended consequences. And that's a very real fear, and it's important to be restrained because of that.
So isn't this a time to plug encryption?
Yeah, I mean, but he was asking about deterrence, and so I feel like, I really think that, we've got a long way to go where we can button up our networks. We're still going to have problems with determined state actors. I think that's right, but it can help a lot in moving forward. And then we have to figure out, I mean, honestly, at some point we actually have to have an adult conversation with the rest of the world about what we think the limits are of offensive and capabilities in cyberspace. We, as a global place, we've had to have that conversation about the limits of war in the real world, and I think at some point we have to have an adult conversation about what that's going to look like in the cyber world. I know, that's doesn't sound very consistent with the current leadership in Washington, D.C., but I think that, eventually we can't, they're going to have to become norms and things that are okay to do and things that are not okay to do and consequences for doing things that are not okay to do that are a lot clearer than they are now. And I think that's going to require a global conversation. The United States, I don't think, can unilaterally do that. We're going to have to have allies, and we're going to have to all agree on what the rules are and what the consequences are for breaking the rules. Because right now, it's just not at all clear. And some of that requires the agencies to talk a little more freely, and people talk a little more freely about what's actually going on. I think the choice by the Obama administration to come out and say that they thought the North Koreans had did the Sony hack, and then say that they thought the Chinese had done the OPM hack, and now the DNC coming out and saying that was the Russians. That's the start of a conversation that, obviously there's still limits. I'm not against secrecy, but it's pretty hard as a world to have a conversation about how this stuff ought to go if, the people who ostensibly are supposed to be in charge of our government, that is us, have no idea about the kind of things that are happening or the way the conversation is going.
Well, Cindy mentioned the Sony hack. We've actually got a question from online about that. Do you think the US government's response was forceful enough? And if not, was that a serious mistake? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I'm not sure we fully know what the U.S. government's response was.
Yeah, I mean, they named them, which was the part that we know, but you might know more. I don't want to get you in trouble.
I'd have to be really careful answering this question. I think it's fair to say that North Korea got the message that they could not interfere with this cherished freedom of expression in the United States. I think they did come to understand that. The reason I think they came to understand that is if you remember, right, I don't know how many of you saw, it was a pretty terrible Seth Rogen movie, but it did eventually get released, and it got released on video and online, and as a patriotic duty, I think I watched it on Christmas Eve, which my mother-in-law will never forgive me for. But that was an interesting moment because it would not have been hard for pretty much any actor in the world to have knocked the distribution of that film offline. And the North Koreans did not do that. That went forward. Now that said, I believe they subsequently started doxing Sony and dropped all the information that they had stolen out on Hollywood salaries and things like that. But that really wasn't something that was kind of covered in the president's remarks about why this was a significant problem. So I do think that North Korea got the message and ceased their activity. I think the key lesson here is that you often don't want to respond with cyber means to a cyber attack, right? If the goal is to get somebody not to do something in cyberspace, don't think of this like nuclear deterrence. We're going to do it back to you and the world will end. That's not how cyber works. Think about how you can use other means to respond so they understand that this kind of behavior is not within global norms on the topic. And I think that was the goal of the response to Sony.
Sherry, is there anything you're allowed to say?
I was just going to say, I agree with that. That's why I think that makes the whole conversation of deterrence very difficult. Because when we think about nuclear deterrence, we're counting nuclear warheads and things, and we sort of knew, what was at stake there. In terms of cyber, it's completely different. And so I think it's very difficult to have a conversation on deterrence, especially when we haven't even all agreed, and this kind of goes back to your conversation. And sometimes I think it's hard to have an adult conversation because we can't find enough adults to have that conversation. So, there does need to be that conversation in terms of, what are the norms? And it was sort of interesting, I think, when you were talking about, or one of us were talking about, when cyber first came to be, people were using cyber to spy and surveil and do the same kinds of things we've done for years, and we were just using cyber to do, now they have another way to do that. But now we're kind of out of that, the other things are happening, and so I think, and from that point, it's like, well, now what do we do? This is just so different than anything that we've had before. So I agree that there need to be consequences, perhaps. I also think that we need to think long and hard about that, because we, like Estonia, are probably one of the most networked and depend on the network for everything that we do. If you think about what you did today, taking a bath, having a cup of coffee, coming here, everything we do is pretty much related to the network in some way. And, we're very, very vulnerable. So we have to think about any sort of response action or retaliatory action, because what comes back could be even worse. And I think you talked about the escalation, which is very, very scary. And so that's what makes this problem so hard.
And if someone goes after my coffee maker, it's over.
Well, soon they'll be able to do that.
I know. My coffee maker's not networked.
Don't put your coffee maker on the internet.
Next question.
At least change the default password.
Absolutely.
The question here.
It is not hard to guess those passwords.
Thanks.
I'd like to ask you more about the private sector, because in this country, we don't have a national government-run power grid or anything. We have a lot of, sometimes varying sizes of private companies are affected in these. So it isn't just the big guys, it's also fairly small companies. And there are a couple of things that occur to me. One is that, believe it or not, there is still some fear and resistance of anything computer and internet related, perhaps more likely distributed at the age level, and I can say that, at the age level of those who are CEOs of companies as opposed to those who are coming in as tech people. And we have felt, it's one of the lovely things about the country, we've felt safe. So the idea of having to protect ourselves is new. It's not hardwired into Americans. So what do you do? We also have all kinds of things about freedom of choice of how you do things, privacy, all those other protections that make it harder to say, you will do this and you will enjoy it. So how do we are all vulnerable if the smallest company that's part of this grid is vulnerable. What do we do to try and combat? Not, this isn't the government level, this isn't the military level, this is the .com level. What do we do to change that?
One thing that we run into when we're advising companies is often an extraordinary lack of internal communication about what is really, what the threats are, particularly ones that maybe that particular company is facing, and also what they're going to contend with in the event that there is some sort of, cyber incident. And one thing that we will have conversations with clients about is just the value of making sure that this isn't just relegated to the tech side, that this is something that is briefed to the board on a regular basis, that is briefed to the C-suite on a regular basis, so that they can make the proper sort of risk management decisions. They don't have to know about the configurations of their networks or anything like that, but they need adequate information to make the right kinds of decisions. And it's interesting that you talk about the government, because I think the government's actually starting to ask those kinds of questions. Some of the regulators are starting to ask those kinds of questions of companies that are you providing your top level officials with enough information so that they can make proper decisions, they can make proper judgments, because not every company is going to decide to to employ, the highest level of security, they may only do that for a certain section of their network if that's what's appropriate. But the important thing is for companies to be making smart decisions based on real information that is specific to sort of their company and based on sort of knowledge of what's going on in their industry. And so I think that one of the most important things that they can do is get educated. And you do sometimes hear, well, the leaders of the company aren't digital natives, and that's okay. But they spend all day, every day evaluating risk. And this is just this is one business risk among many that they need to weigh. And I think that as they start to think about it that way, and you can kind of demystify the cyber piece of it, you don't have to talk about ones and zeros, but you can talk about what data is most important to you. Most companies have a major data component to them. What are you doing to protect it? Where is it? What's going on your networks? How aware are you of what the risks are, and how are you balancing that they can start to make smarter decisions?
So if I was just going to add to that, totally agree with all of that, but I would say there's two things. One, recognizing that fundamentally the responsibility for protecting your network systems and data is yours as the owner of that system. There is nobody in the federal government who is going to ride in on a white horse and save you because you underinvested in your own security. Full stop, right? The government will support you. The government may share information with you. The government will prosecute the criminals. The government will do all kinds of things, but the government's not going to come in and take this burden away from you. I used to get in trouble with my boss for saying that our policy, our cyber policy, was kind of like the Home Depot model. It was, essentially, right, you can do it, we can help, you're responsible. Companies really don't like that, but we would often get these calls every time there was an incident, and it would say, we're under attack, you need to do something. Okay, what? What do you want us to do? And the answer would be, well, we want you to do one of two things. We want you to block the attack, or we want you to hit back. Well, okay, we'll just turn on the Great Firewall of the United States, which we do not have and you do not want us to have. Or two, okay, we'll take out that botnet and the command and control servers that are conveniently located in China, Russia, and Iran, right? No, they're all in the United States. And so if you want to give lawyers in the White House counsel office a good problem to wrestle with, tell them that you want Cyber Command to attack a server in Plano, Texas.
That may be in a hospital.
That may be in a hospital. See what they come up with. And so, my giving a long answer, now I'll give you a short answer. The thing that we really need to do is find a way to get companies to invest more in cybersecurity. We have a Republican Congress, we have a Republican administration. I don't know why we haven't seen tax credits for cybersecurity. We need to get spending up.
Part of it is the mule tamer joke. First, you've got to get their attention. And I don't know that we have everybody's attention.
Wait, what's the mule tamer joke?
Yeah, I want to know it
So
too.
quietly to the mule, it does everything he wants, and the other person tries it, it doesn't work. And they say, well, show me how. And the first thing he does is take a 2x4. So you're just supposed to talk quietly. Well, yes, but first you've got to get his attention.
I'm going to use that the next time I do one of these. I mean,
Which is interesting, though,
joke.
because I don't know, all they have to do is read the newspaper, or read anything to listen to the news to get their attention. I agree with what they said. The one other thing I would add is that many companies, I think the philosophy has to be that the cybersecurity, and I'll put the security word in there, everyone has to own it. Because it's not just the IT people, it's not just the C-suite. No. I mean, it is everyone that touches a computer at all in any of these companies has to own cybersecurity. Because what has happened in a lot of these things is, we've made it so easy. They send out all of these emails, the phishing emails that look like they come from your friend, and people click on them, and lo and behold, now they have a foothold in the company, and once they're on your computer, then they often, we used to describe a lot of networks as like M&Ms. They're kind of crunchy on the outside, and when you get on the inside, they're soft and mushy. So, once you get past that firewall, which, some unwilling participant has helped them do, then you can just move around freely inside the network because there's nothing in there to deter. So I think it's getting every employee of these companies to be aware and to own the cybersecurity problem. And I think some of that is training, just cyber awareness. And as you pointed out, probably many my age or maybe even less aware than some of the kids in kindergarten. These, so it's very uneven, and so so we have to help people, do that. I will say, and just really quickly, and one thing which is interesting is we, and one job that I had, we kind of did this red team thing where we actually wanted to see how prepared this company was. And so we actually sent out 100 emails to 100 different people, and it said, "This is a phishing attack" in the subject line, and we wanted to see what the response was. And do you know how many people opened that email? Anybody guess? 100. 100 people out of 100 opened the email, and it was almost like, well, if I click on it really fast, and then delete it, it'll all be okay. But people, we just don't help ourselves. We just have to be more aware and.
But I would also say that, well, this is all true, and I'm not disagreeing with it. We have to put pressure on the people who build our systems to build them more securely. I mean, Microsoft's made great strides in the last few years making their systems more secure, but they've got a long way to go. I mean, the idea that one click on an email is how you change you can get into somebody's credentials. There should be two-factor authentication. There's lots of room for the people who build our tools to make those tools protect us better. And I think that to the extent it's absolutely important that we get all the way down to end users and we get them cybersecurity, but to a certain extent, I mean, that's not really fair. I mean, yes, they should take responsibility, but the idea that we're offloading responsibility, like it's, when you buy a car, right? Like, you don't have to then go out and research the locks and figure out what kind of lock you should have and have a whole conversation about locks and have this whole big thing. That thing should come with a lock that works. And I think we should hold the people who build these technologies that are holding our data, who, to me have a almost fiduciary responsibility. I think we should make it a fiduciary responsibility to protect it, to actually build tools that stand with us as opposed to cutting the corners and not thinking about security. So I want to push some of this responsibility up to the tool makers and the network builders, because there are techniques out there. Two-factor authentication is one of them. Forward secrecy is another. There's all of these things. My organization built a tool called Let's Encrypt that is, along with Mozilla, that basically to try to make sure that the websites that you visit offer you strong security when you go there. Again, why is a little organization based in San Francisco encrypting the web? What the hell? I mean, look, I'm happy to do it, and all you who's joined EFF support us in building this, but, and we're now building a new one to make your email servers, when they talk to each other, be more secure using something called Start TLS. We're having to build basic security infrastructure for the web, and to me, that means something's broken and it needs to be fixed. I'm happy to do it, we'll continue to do it, but I don't think it's right for that kind of responsibility to be placed in a public interest nonprofit. It should be the companies themselves and people taking responsibility to try to make our tools more secure.
Though you do deserve credit because you got Google to do that.
Yes, we did.
And so that's actually, I think, is a very big company taking responsibility.
And now HTTPS and certificate authorities and all of that stuff is becoming much more used to it. And it started because we built an observatory that helped track where it was working and where it wasn't, and that wasn't enough. And so we built something called HTTPS Everywhere, which is a plugin for your browser that helps make sure that you get security, and that wasn't enough. And so we built a certificate authority, which helps on the back end to make sure that the websites do it. That's great, and I'm happy that we do it, and we guilt those companies really well, and we'll keep doing it. But there's a lot of work that can be done before you're kind of guilting grandma about not understanding security, and I worry sometimes this devolves down to that too soon.
I think that's a good point, but it's also interesting that you bring up cars, because the problem is actually if you need a software update on your car, unless you have a Tesla, more often than not, you've got to bring it in. And so I think it's a huge problem, just the notion. I mean, the reason why most people aren't patching and most companies aren't patching is because it takes so much sort of care and feeding that it's not, I don't think that companies are sort of like willfully neglecting. It's just that it ends up not being prioritized because there's just so much of it to do. And, it would be a huge service if the sort of proprietors of these systems and the software could find more elegant ways to do these kinds of security updates, because it is, I mean, it does feel quite unfair to expect that somehow grandma with her Comcast account or something is going to, you know, sort of hold the line against, you know, a botnet, much less Iran. But, you know, I mean, but when her computer gets commandeered into something that ultimately, you know, becomes an attack vehicle, that's a real problem. And it isn't fair to expect grandma or even me to be able to figure that out on a regular basis.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We could keep going all night, but please join me in thanking our panel.